Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians within the central and southern parts of the Donetsk region, while the Ukrainians managed to recapture some positions in the northern outskirts of the Donetsk region, as well as a continuation of the Kupiansk counterattack to free up their forces within the city and push back the Russians from their foothold in the northern parts of it. The Russians in turn managed to make a small advance west of Toretsk in the direction of Kashantinivka, in between Kashantinivka and Pokrovsk, as well as within the city of Pokrovsk, as well as to the southern flank of the city. Russians also made two advances in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and within the Zaporizhia region. Starting out in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians made numerous advances all throughout the past day. The Russians first managed to push through from the northern flank of Lysivka, and with their control over Novokrenka, cut off the highway connecting to the fortified position before storming these fortified positions from numerous directions, gaining control of them, following which the Russians moved further north to control the forest lines and fields south of Novopavlivka, securing the fortified positions along the river line and the western flank of Lysivka as the Russians push along the railway towards the city of Pokrovsk itself. The Russians also started storming Shakhtarsky district by gaining control over additional apartment complex buildings following the initial push towards it. Now the Russians have managed to gain control over additional apartment complex buildings in the southwestern outskirts of it, while also pushing towards the western outskirts of it along the eastern flank of Troyanda, while the Ukrainians still have a presence within the outskirts of Troyanda and along the forest patch areas. The Russians are looking to gain control over the Shakhtarsky district by slowly pushing through, gaining a foothold, and starting offensive operations within it. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the southeastern outskirts of Pokrovsk by gaining control over Novopavlivka to the southeast, the railway area up towards Hnativka, and storming the Shakhtarsky district, which is the most important district within Pokrovsk in terms of military defense capabilities. The Russians also started storming the city in the southwestern outskirts, regaining control over positions within it. The Russians this time around have a stable supply line through the southwestern outskirts of the city under their control, and are pushing through the residential areas and establishing themselves within the garage area here in the southwestern parts of the city. The first time the Russians went into the city of Pokrovsk, there were simply DRG and smaller units with no supply line that moved through the first lines north of Troyanda as the Russians established themselves in the western parts of it. This time the Russians have control over the residential area and are supplying the forces through that. They already had a build-up before this initial push, allowing them to cut off the E50 highway going through towards the Shakhtarsky district, cutting off one of the two supply lines that leads into it to supply the Ukrainian forces fighting within it. At the same time, they are expanding the zone of control towards the central parts of it. The Russians have now also scouted these areas and cleared the pathway for their main forces to push through. The concentration of Russian forces within the city of Pokrovsk is now larger than the initial one and are concentrated in a smaller area. The Russians are looking to advance along the railway area towards Hnativka to cut off the eastern highway, while already having cut off the western highway to isolate the Shakhtarsk district, potentially encircling it or operationally encircling it for the storming and siege of it. Despite significant amount of Ukrainian reinforcements arriving to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, freeing up some of the supply lines and the pressure on the flanks of the city, the Russians' positions within the southern flank of the city have been prepared for many months, and the Russians are now taking advantage of that to catch the Ukrainian forces off guard with a new push that is seeing some initial success. If the Russians are able to keep up this success, then the Shakhtarsky district is in danger of falling into Russian hands, which can then lead to a snowball effect where the Russians will quickly be gaining control over the southern parts of the city, cutting off the E50 highway from connecting to Mirnorod, and with the positions north of the city, Mirnorod could end up operationally or physically encircled as Russians pressure the city on the eastern, northern, and southern flanks. Moving on to the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and into the Zaporizhia region, the Russians have managed to gain control over the two fortified positions that were encircled by the Russian forces, following a push from Melivka in the northern flank and towards Komishovacha in the southern flank and eastern flanks. The Russians now lack control over the remaining parts of the defensive line and the remaining parts of Komishovacha, before gaining full control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, and moving onwards towards Andrivka, Kleptsova, and Seleny for counterattacks to regain these positions along the Vovcha River line. Further south, the Russians continue offensive operations north of Polivsky, gaining control of additional forest lines as they continue offensive operations alongside both the first and second lines of defense here in the Zaporizhia region. Further north, in the area between Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Novopavlivka and alongside the defensive line and the supply road between Drushkivka and Shekhova and Volodymyrivka. The Russians are slowly advancing alongside the field here in between Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk with the objective of reaching the outskirts of multiple settlements to allow the Russians gain fire control over the highway supplying Kostiantynivka through Drushkivka and connecting it with Kramatorsk. The Russians also managed to advance to the north of Toretsk, gaining control over some of the forest lines and defensive positions, expanding the zone of control alongside the crossing where the Ukrainians continue to resupply the forces within Klebenbik and on the outskirts of Novospeske. Further north in the Liman direction, the Ukrainians launched a continued counterattack in the direction of Rydkotop, where they are attempting to regain full control over the town. Following their push towards the southern parts of the settlement, the Ukrainians are now continuing their offensive operations, advancing along these streets. As we see with this located footage, the Ukrainians are slowly advancing through it under fire by Russian artillery and FPV drones, as the Russians are looking to inflict as many casualties as possible during this Ukrainian counterattack. However, if the Ukrainians are able to regain control over Rydkotop, they could start threatening Anova and encircle the Russian push in the direction of Flushenkova. This means that the Russian forces advancing alongside the northern flank of the positions across the Sherbets River line could risk encirclement by the Ukrainian forces and can already be considered operationally encircled, with the Ukrainian counterattack in the direction of Novomir and Novomikhailivka from the northern flank and therefore attacks in the southern flank through Rydkotop. Further north in the Kupiansk direction, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks on the western flank of Kupiansk as they manage to regain control over the street in the direction of Moskovka. The Ukrainians are slowly pushing the Russians out of the western parts of the city before moving onwards towards the northern parts of it, while the Russians are looking to consolidate their positions, gain control of the apartment complex area along the river line, and strengthen their positions in the supply routes leading to Moskovka for a potential counterattack in that direction. Therefore, we see a lot of positional fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, as the Ukrainians are attempting to kick the Russians out of the city, and the Russians are attempting to double down, consolidate their positions, and hold their forces, defending against the Ukrainian counterattack in the western parts of the city. We're seeing across the front line the Russians continue offensive operations throughout the Donetsk region, while the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks at whatever opportunity they get, whether it is the northern, eastern, or southern section of the front line. The Ukrainians are attempting to slow down the Russian offensive operations and regain control over areas that will give them an advantageous defensive position. Yet what we are seeing despite the Ukrainian reinforcements is that the Russian positions within Pokrovsk are steadily advancing. The Russians made 2 advances within the same day, and just now, additional reports come from additional advances. So as I am making this video, the reports just came on from Anatoly Radov, who is a Russian civilian who has contact with a lot of Russian soldiers, different groups, and civilians in different areas within Ukraine. According to his latest report, following the reports of the initial 2 advances and additional advances taking place, the Russians advanced through the streets in the central parts along the garage area, further north, getting control over the intersection here, just to the northwest of the mall here in the central parts of the city, and to the outskirts of it. Then down along the roads through the Pokrovsk Street, gaining control over the secondary garage area, storage area here in the central parts of the city, and down alongside the apartment complex area just northwest of the Shakhtarsky district, then along the diagonal road leading towards the E50 highway and alongside the E50 highway. This is the third advance by the Russian forces within 24 hours within the central parts of the Pokrovsk direction, as well as the southwestern outskirts of the city, where through this, the Russians now have control over an additional section of the central and southwestern parts of the city. This is a strong push by the Russian forces that is completely unexpected by the Ukrainians, as so far they've been unable to respond to it. If the Russians are able to consolidate these positions, push into the apartment complex areas and the central parts of the city, consolidate these positions, and cut off the road leading to the Shakhtarsky district, then the Russians can cut off the supplies leading into it and significantly strengthen their siege of it. If these advances can also push into the rear of the Shakhtarsky district and gain control over some positions there, then the Shakhtarsky district itself can fall fairly quickly, and a push towards the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city can turn the battle over the city in favor of the Russians. The Russians are also, with this push, gaining another opportunity to push through the TO406 highway to gain control of it and have an additional supply route for their forces leading into the city. Following the capture of the designated western flanks of their forces is now secure for operations towards the western parts of the city. The Russians will now be increasing their offensive operations in the direction of the city, and the Ukrainian forces will now be responding in any way they know how to prevent a collapse of the city, which would have significant consequences for the forces operating in the area, as the Russians will gain control over a major supply hub for offensive operations going further north and west of the area in the direction of Dobropilya and the Dnipropetrovsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.